Hello, I'm your host, Marcus Ruiz-Evans. We have a very special episode of National Divorce, where we're going to interview Professor Joseph Huddleston, who's an expert in international relations, and we're going to talk to him about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her call for national divorce here in America. Let's get right to it. Give me 1 second, and we'll see you in just a moment. Welcome. Let me show you the interview right now, and we'll get right to it. So this was, let me make sure that's showing. Okay, score. This was the show. You will see it in today's block. Professor R. Joseph Huddleston, PhD, at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. He's recently published 2 books, Conflict and Peace in Western Sahara, the Role of the UN's Peacekeeping Mission, and Handbook of Research Methods in International Relations. Here is his page at Seton Hall University, a little bit on his bio. Professor Huddleston is an assistant professor in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He specializes in diplomacy by rebel groups, dynamics in intra-state conflict, and research design. His current work focuses on diplomatic activities of secessionists, separatists, and self-determination movements, as well as how international actors help or hinder separatist groups apart from diplomatic recognition. He also studies how civilian populations respond to violence and economic disruption in civil war. He has published in the Journal of Peace Research, Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Review, and has written for the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. Recently, he did publish 2 books, Research Methods of International Relations and Conflict and Peace in the Sahara. And we did an interview with him. Now, originally, I met the professor years ago after he wrote this article in Foreign Affairs magazine, Spain's Flawed Response to the Catalonia Referendum, How Its Overreaction Legitimized the Call for Independence, October 2017. I called him recently and said, hey, could we talk? Since we haven't talked in about 5 years or 6, I'd like to ask you about concepts for independence and calls for secession, and are there less or more of them? And this was the interview that we did. So I talked with the professor from 4:37 this afternoon to about 6:03 p.m. this afternoon Pacific time, or about 1 hour and 23 minutes. He said he did not want to be recorded, but that I could interview him and tell people what we talked about. So here's a review of what we talked about. Now, the first thing I asked him was, we haven't talked in 5 years. Are things better now, or are they more divisive? He said, compared to January 2021, things are better now. He also said the midterm elections showed that people will not vote for Trump or Green, although they still have followings. This shows moderation. So he was pleased to see in the midterm elections that things, a lot of people didn't vote for Trump or Green. That shows a moderation. He was also pleased to see that things have calmed down since January 6th. Certainly things have calmed down since January 6th. However, partisanship is terrible today, and it has not improved since the 4 years we talked ago. 6 years, really. It hasn't become worse, but it hasn't improved. He was emphatic about that. I'm not saying it got worse, but it hasn't gotten better at all in 6 years. It's a mixed picture, he would say. School boards have increased in partisanship. Whoever thought they'd see partisanship in school boards? So that's an increase in partisanship. At the same time, there's been a walk back from partisanship, with Donald Trump losing the election for presidency and Republicans starting to step away from him to some degree. He also said, I personally think secession is a bad idea. He doesn't support secession. He thinks people have no idea how costly it is. But he did admit, I have a friend from my own hometown who said maybe we should go it alone. So the conversation about national divorce has grown everywhere. He said he was surprised. Now, he doesn't support secession. He thinks people don't understand the cost behind it. But he had to say, when I went home, I was shocked to see one of my personal friends talking about maybe we should go it alone. He didn't expect to see that. And what that told him is that the conversation is national. People are more comfortable talking about national divorce than in the past, but I don't think it's going to boil over. So he says people are more comfortable talking about national divorce, but he doesn't think we've reached a boiling point. He thinks things have improved in the last couple of years. They basically stayed hot. And one of the things he said is that things can stay hot for a long time and never boil over into action. So he studied secession movements around the world. Sometimes people get mad and they just stay mad for 2, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, but they don't actually do anything about it. Now he's saying maybe it could get worse. Maybe it could get better. Things haven't improved, but they haven't got to the boiling point. He also said, yes, there is an appetite in America for comments coming from Green about national divorce. So I said, Professor, aren't people already segregating according to the big sort? The landmark book covered by National Public Radio in 2008 and again in 2023, talking about how people are sorting themselves. They're moving to different regions to be near politically like-minded people. Doesn't that mean we're already having a national divorce? He said, yes, people are sorting themselves based upon politics like the big sort says. But for true national divorce to happen, even more official sorting would have to take place. So yes, there's a lot of sorting. Yes, landslide election counties have gone from 1/3 to 50% in the last couple of years. Yes, there's a lot of sorting, perhaps more than we've ever seen, but it's not enough to achieve the national divorce, in his professional opinion, that Marjorie Taylor Greene is looking like. You would need to have a national announcement that state borders are going to split and people have 1 to 2 years to move. That's the level of separation required to make a national divorce happen, and we aren't there yet, although clearly there's a trend going that way. But we're not there yet, hasn't boiled over, and maybe it will never boil over and just stay hot. He was emphatic about that. Yes, it's hot. Yes, it stayed hot. But there are other places in the world where things stay hot and nothing ever happens. Also, if it's hot, it's easy to go to a boil. Could go to a boil, could just stay this way and never get worse. But yeah, it hasn't improved. But if we're going to have the big sort like a national divorce like Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying, yes, we had the big sort, but we're going to need to do even more. He also wanted to point out that, yeah, people are moving to different states, but they're not really just moving to a state to get away from another state. They're moving to a rural or urban area. And so even within these states people are moving to, you have this rural-urban boundary. And he goes, what if a state secedes? The red part of the state secedes, leaving a huge blue bastion behind us, another state. Now that red state has a minority community left in it who could be liberals. That will result in another internal division and cause another secessionist movement from within that state that just seceded. So the moment Texas breaks up into a red and blue state, how do you know that there isn't a minority of blue in the red state who will begin agitating for another level of secession? That was his point. I would argue that because you're approaching 50-50 percentages of red-blue, that's why these states don't work. And if you went to a state where 80% of the population was red, it really wouldn't matter if a minority was 20% blue. They're going nowhere. They can complain, but there's no division potential because they're just too small a minority of that broken away state. That's how I would respond to that. No, I did not tell him that response. So I don't have a response to his response on that. Why does the media act like there's no national division now, when there were many national news stories that proved there was increasing division, and yet all of the media forgot about that? I pointed out how you had Anna Kasparian and the Young Turks, you had Breaking Points, you had Stephen Colbert saying, well, Marjorie Taylor Greene says, I want national divorce, and everyone I know talks about it. And all these people and many others in the media would say, you're a stupid idiot. Nobody's talking about national divorce. Nobody's having this conversation. And he goes, well, actually, that's just not true. Yeah. Yes, people have these conversations. Yes, there were divided. Yes, there were national news stories. But the media has agendas. So they don't want to mention it. He also said, do not count on the national media to have the informed conversation you're looking for. So yes, the media, most likely, in my interpretation of what he said, intentionally did not cover the fact there was national divorce because it got real when Marjorie Taylor Greene said that, and they didn't want to let you know there was something to it, so they lied to you. When we see that Marjorie Taylor Greene was in Congress and called for secession, and that Ted Cruz was in the Senate and called for secession, doesn't it prove a historical mark that this hasn't happened since right before the Civil War? That say whatever you want about national divorce is heating up or it's not heating it up. Isn't it a historical fact that we have not had a sitting Congress member and a sitting senator while in Congress say, let's secede since right before the Civil War? And he goes, that's a fact. That is true. Does that mean we're going to secede or national divorce? No, but you are correct when you say historically, we haven't seen anything like this since right before the Civil War. It's been about a century and a half. When we see that when I started CalExit and said nation state and people laughed, and now the governor says it all the time, and I had to push for CalExit, but when Roe v. Wade was overturned, 3 different California newspapers pushed for secession and op-eds. Doesn't that show a normalization of the conversation when looking at this trajectory? So when I wrote the book CalExit in 2011, 2012, I started saying nation state, people laughed in my face. Then we had COVID. Governor started saying nation state all the time. Now everybody says nation state. Anybody in Sacramento can say nation state. Governor says nation state. Nobody laughs at them. Before that, people laughed. Then I talked about how CalExit got big in 2016. We pushed for CalExit. But then when Roe v. Wade was overturned, 3 different California newspapers issued op-ed pieces immediately calling for secession. I had nothing to do with that. Why did all this happen? Doesn't that show a normalization of the conversation? He goes, yes. When you look at the fact that you used to not be able to say nation state without people laughing, and when you look at the fact that you had to push for secession, but then when Roe v. Wade was overturned, newspapers, not even in contact with you, were talking about secession. Yes, that does show a normalization of the conversation, given this trajectory. I also asked, when Californians don't call for secession, but say, let's stop paying federal income taxes when things happen in the federal government that they don't like, is this more sane than calling for secession? No. So I said, yes. A lot of times something bad happens in the federal government. And when Trump was president, there was calls for secession. And right after Trump was done being president, there were calls for secession. But even though the calls for secession have been toned down in California the last couple of years, every time something bad happens in the federal government, Kavanaugh gets confirmed to the Supreme Court. Amy Coney Barrett gets confirmed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. We see a ton of Californians saying, let's just stop paying federal income taxes. So for every one person saying, let's CalExit and secede, oh, that's crazy. 7 people are going, I have the more reasonable idea of let's stop paying federal income taxes. And I said, when you have a bunch of people who say, let's stop paying federal income taxes, is that a more sane response than let's secede? And he goes, no, because not paying federal income taxes is the first step to secession. Basically what he said. So you may not like the idea of secession, but this idea of I'm going to stop paying taxes is what countries do when they want to secede. So it kind of proves Californians still open to the idea, although they said, no, secession is crazy. I just said stop paying federal income taxes, which is something around the world that causes secession movements. Californians aren't aware of that, but I was very pleased at one point in the conversation, as I was pointing out how Californians newspapers called for secession after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I didn't know them and I didn't ask for that. He goes, I think you're partially responsible for that. So I took that as a compliment, like the compliment that I got from Professor F.H. Buckley, that I'm a much better spokesperson for national divorce than Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm going to add to that this comment from Professor Joseph Huddleston, where he says, I think you're partially responsible for that, for creating the condition where when Roe v. Wade was overturned, 3 different California newspapers said, let's secede. And I didn't talk to him. He also pointed out the ticket for California to achieve independence is for red states, for CalExit workers, supporters to work with red states and get a campaign for Kick California out. He said, that's a great idea. Finally, he gave me a gift. He said, make sure to read a book by Christopher Wellman called A Theory of Secession. So that was the interview I did with Professor Joseph Huddleston. It's about an hour and 23 minutes. This was the article that first allowed us to meet. Here he is talking about some of the books he's made. Here he is at Seton Hall University with incredible pedigree backing up everything he knows. And this is the cover for the show. Well, relatively straightforward. Hope you enjoyed it. We're going to try to keep doing interviews with high-level professors, lawyers, and politicians on the topic of national divorce because nobody else seems to be able to do that. And we hope to continue. All right. Thank you very much. And we'll see you soon.